Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's 1 minute after 5. So thank you very much for joining me at the end of what I'm sure has been a very long day for you guys. I have to admit I didn't catch breakfast this morning and it feels like a long day for me. So I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about Resource Manager today. My name is Ryan Jones. I'm the Principal PM for Resource Manager. And so myself, along with my band of engineers, are the folks that bring you guys Resource Manager. So out of curiosity, how many of you are Azure customers? Good. That'll make this a bit easier. How many of you are hopeful Azure Stack customers? Okay, a few of those as well. Okay, awesome. Just wanted to make sure I understood going into this. With that in mind, this was a 400-level session, correct? So to give you an overview of some of the things that we're going to be talking about, we'll be doing some work in PowerShell. We'll be doing some work from the command prompt. We're going to spend a little bit of time in Visual Studio working with JSON. But what I need is a promise from you guys, okay? How many of you guys consider yourselves developers? Okay. So you guys have to promise not to leave when I talk about PowerShell. And how many of you consider yourselves to be IT pros? You have to promise not to leave when I show you JSON, okay? Because they work together. And your hand was up for both? If you love both, then you get to stay here the whole time and I don't have to worry about you leaving. The reason I joke with you guys is traditionally the minute I open Visual Studio, half of the IT pros leave. And so I want to make sure that we walk through this together to understand how we're bringing development, how we're bringing operations together with Resource Manager. So before we go any further, what is Resource Manager? And in short, it's the new consistent management layer for managing your resources in the public cloud or in the private cloud. So if we look at the top of your screen over here, at the top you see we have a number of tools or clients or callers of this API. These are things like the new Azure portal. It also includes our command line tools and our PowerShell tools. And then it also includes Visual Studio or other tooling solutions. Okay? All three of these different surfaces consume the same set of APIs. So one of the things that's cool about Resource Manager is if you see it in Visual Studio, if you see it in the portal, there's an API for that. We don't really have the notion of private portal-only APIs anymore. So below that, we have the Resource Manager service itself, which handles routing all API requests for management in the public cloud or in the private cloud. Now we authenticate and authorize these requests using JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs. These are provided by Azure Active Directory or ADFS. We then take these requests and route them to all of the services that you guys know and hopefully love. Websites, databases, virtual machines, virtual networks, storage, so on and so forth. Okay? So we'll be looking at three main areas today. Number one is how do I use Resource Manager to deploy my applications into the cloud? Number two, we'll be looking at how Resource Manager helps you organize your resources and your applications in the cloud. Why is this important? Well, what we're seeing is a transition from where people were, test driving or kicking the tires on the cloud. And folks are now starting to deploy many, many applications, many, many resources. And so how many of you have gone into the old portal and you had like several hundred VMs and you had that big, long list? Yeah, right? We need better ways to organize these things. So we're going to talk about how to do that. And then finally, what we want to talk about is, these are no longer just dev or just test environments that you're deploying to the public cloud. These are mission-critical apps. And so we want to talk about how Resource Manager helps you control access to those resources and those applications, how it helps you audit actions against them, and also how we can prevent some mistakes as well. Okay? So let's dig into what deployment looks like with Resource Manager. Number one is deployment is primarily template-driven. What we've heard is we want people to be able to consistently, quickly, and repeatably be able to deploy applications once again, many, many times. Now, this template-driven model is declarative in nature. So how many of you guys are familiar with declarative versus imperative programming models? Okay, so the way I look at it is the declarative is a really fancy way of saying, what is my goal state? How do I want this application to look like in the cloud? Well, an imperative API call is simply a statement that says, I would like a VM. Okay? Now, deploying these templates is also idempotent. What this means is you can execute the same template more than once with the same set of input parameters, and you will get the same outcome each time, even if some of those resources already exist. Why? Well, if the resource doesn't exist, what we do is we create it, and if it does already exist, we update it to the state that you have just described. Additionally, Resource Manager is natively multi-service. So how many of you guys have deployed a cloud service but then also wanted to use like SQLDB or website? Right, and you couldn't do that through a single document. Well, with Resource Manager, you can. In addition to that, it's also natively multi-region. And so what we see people doing is, for the first time, building one application through a single resource group template that spans data centers around the globe. Scott's talked about a number of times. We now have 19 Azure data centers. It's pretty amazing to see people building and creating templates where with one PowerShell commandlet, they deploy an application to 19 data centers. It's pretty phenomenal. It blows my mind. And then finally, this is an extensible deployment model. So not only can you define the topology of your virtual machines, websites, databases, and other resources, but you can also initialize the application state from inside of those resources, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So before we proceed any further, I think it's really important that we introduce a couple of concepts. And the first one that I want to talk about is the resource group, okay? And if I were to summarize this in one sentence, a resource group is like a folder on your file system. It's a container into which you put stuff, or in this case, resources, okay? Now, one thing that's a little bit different, and maybe where my file system analogy breaks down, is that resources must exist in one and only one resource group. Okay, so we don't have the notion really of resources that exist outside of the context of a resource group. Why? Well, the resource group is supposed to be representative of the management lifecycle that you expect to exert or exercise over those resources. And so with that in mind, resource groups can span regions. So I can create a resource group, and in that resource group, as I mentioned earlier, it can contain resources in all 19 of the Azure data centers. And then additionally, resource groups can span services. So let's say you go out and you create this resource group. Hey, great, now what? Well, you want to put resources into it. And one of the common questions that we get from people is, well, how do I do that? And while we do recommend a declarative deployment model for Resource Manager using templates, we do still support imperative-based deployment. So if you want to continue running your new Azure VM commandlets with Resource Manager, you can still do that. Okay? In addition, there's a lot of things that really make no sense to do declaratively, like restart a VM. How do I declare restarting a VM, right? It just doesn't make sense. So we support both imperative and declarative, and we do actually foresee that you will still use imperative APIs and operations for your day-to-day administration of your services. So with that in mind, let's talk about what a deployment is. A deployment is an entity which tracks template execution. So what does this mean? I create a resource group. I then create a deployment in that resource group, and that deployment tracks executing, compiling, and then provisioning of all the resources defined in a template. This template always exists in one and only one resource group, because a deployment is actually a resource, just like all those other resources, okay? And what this does is it allows us to create what we call nested deployments, which you can imagine if you have very, very large or very complex applications, you can have a template in a template in a template, so on and so forth. Okay? So, since this is a 400-level session, how about we switch off of slides and look at some demos? So, fingers crossed. Hey, I got it right. So we're going to start in PowerShell today, and what we're going to do, we're going to take a step back in time, and we're going to do a hello world example. Okay, I remember the first time I had to code in C++ or C or whatever, Java, PHP. They made us do a little bit of everything. I never really got good at any of them, but I learned to write hello world a lot. And so what we're going to do is a hello world resource group. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to add Azure account. And what this is going to do is it is going to log me into Azure. And so it's going to redirect me to Microsoft's ADFS servers. I'm going to enter my password. And what you'll note is Microsoft has actually set up two-factor authentication for people using Azure inside of our organization. So one of the cool things here is you as the IT organization can govern policies around how people can manage resources through ARM, including requiring things such as 2FA. So I'm going to log in with my virtual smart card. And now what's happening behind the scenes is that JSON Web Token, or JOT, that we talked about earlier, is now available inside of my PowerShell session. You'll see it pulls in my subscriptions. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch Azure mode. This is very, very important because, as you guys have noticed, like last week is when we announced the new compute APIs that exist under Resource Manager. We still support the old Service Manager APIs, or Service Management APIs. And so you have to tell PowerShell which set of commandlets you want to use. We then run some demo magic that I'm not going to talk about anymore. And then we create our resource group. So you'll see we specify the name of the resource group as well as the location of the resource group. Now you may be wondering, well, wait a second, Ryan, you just said that resource groups can span regions. And yes, you are correct. What this is specifying the location of the metadata that pertains to the resource group itself. So let's say you have some data sovereignty concerns. You can specify in which of the 19 Azure regions the metadata about your resource group is stored. Okay? And then finally what we do is we create the Azure Resource Group deployment. We give that deployment a name, Hello World Demo. We specify the name of the resource group, which we just created, and we specify the template file to use for executing this template. This template file can be local on your machine. It can also be exposed via publicly accessible HTTP endpoint. And so in this case, what you'll see is we're deploying a template file, which is sitting out on GitHub. Okay? Now, a couple of other notes here. This is a very simple example that doesn't require parameters. Parameters can also be specified via a parameters file. They can be specified inline, or they can be specified interactively. And you'll see this here in just a moment. So here's that scary part where I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and you guys have to promise not to walk out, okay? I thought about doing it in Notepad, but we don't get syntax highlighting. So that's why we're doing this in Visual Studio. Visual Studio does have good capabilities for authoring your JSON templates, and I would encourage you to use that. With that said, we do publish all of our schemas, and so you can use other template authoring editors as well, like Notepad++ or Sublime Text or whatever you like. So there's a couple of important parts to any template. The first thing is the schema, and that defines what JSON schema we use to validate the template. The next thing is the content version, which is really just the version that you guys specify about what is in this template. And we use this to ensure that the template that you provide us matches the parameters that you provide us. The next thing we do is we provide a place where you define the parameters or the pieces of data that you want to gather from the user. Below that, we then have a section which would include variables, which would allow you to set additional values that are used during template execution, or you can manipulate the parameters that were passed into you by the user. Finally, we have the resources section, which is really the meat of what most of these templates do. And then at the very end, we have a section where you can output things from execution of the template. And this is where we return a variable called result, and it says hello world back to us. And so if I pull up my PowerShell window right here, you'll see at the end of the template execution, you'll see we have result of type string hello world. So that is our first template together. So, hey, great, we did hello world, but you'll notice we really didn't have any parameters. We didn't provision any resources. So now let's look at a template that actually does something. And to show that we're able to work across many platforms, let's say you have to support developers that are running on the Linux or the Mac OS platform, or maybe they don't like PowerShell. We see that sometimes as well. We support doing this from the command line as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run, I have a little batch file that will run this script. So the first thing that we're going to do, just like over in PowerShell, is we're going to log in. And here in a moment, I will be prompted for my username and password. It's going to authenticate and retrieve that token for me. Takes a few seconds. It then selects a default subscription for me. Note that I have omitted a step. If you do have a large number of subscriptions, you may need to actually select the subscription that you want to use for creating your resource group and creating your resource group deployment. The next thing I do is I switch config mode, just like I did in PowerShell. I then create a resource group. Here, let's do this so that we can look at this a bit better. And then I create the deployment. And so here what you'll see is our Azure CLI is intelligent enough to see that we defined a set of parameters in this template, and some of them don't have default values. And so what it's going to do is interactively prompt me to provide these parameter values. And so in this case, I will create a storage account called Ignite Demo Rye Jones. And so what's going to happen is that parameter is now pulled into the template, and we submit the deployment to Resource Manager for execution in Azure. And here in about 15 seconds or so, we'll see that that has come back and completed. So while it does that, let's actually take a look at the syntax of this template. So just like in our earlier example, the first line here defines which version of the schema our template is written in. The next line, of course, is the content version. And then after that, we define which parameters we want to gather from the user. So the first thing that you'll see is storage account name. This was, as you saw, the parameter which I was prompted for. The next parameter is storage account type. And you'll see we're able to specify which values are allowed to be provided by the user. Now, in this case, we specify a default value, because let's face it, it makes for a better demo. But you can also specify defaults here so that the users don't always have to supply input. For location, we do the exact same thing. So now what I want to do is scroll down to really the meat of the template, which is the resources section. Okay, and in the resources section, this always follows a consistent shape. It is always an array of what we call the resource definition. Okay, the resource definition always has type, which is the resource type. In this case, it is of type storage accounts in the Microsoft.storage namespace. Below that, we have the name of the resource itself, where we use a template language expression to retrieve the parameter that was provided by the end user. We specify an API version because we support many, many API versions for all of these services concurrently, and so the user needs to tell us which API version to use. We then retrieve the location from the parameters provided by the user. And then finally, we have the properties section. And in this properties section is where each individual resource type has its own unique and distinct set of properties, okay? So in the case of storage, its property that it cares about is the account type, but in the case of website, it might be a different set of properties, so on and so forth. So while you won't see many changes in the resource definition shape, you will see variations in the properties from one resource to the next, okay? And then finally, as the output of this template, what we do is we use our reference template language expression to perform a get against the storage account that we just created so that we can see what this storage account looks like. Okay? So, we'll switch back. Get my clicker. So I spoke briefly about the template language expressions that we use inside of the Resource Manager templates. We have fairly broad set of language constructs. Number one is base64 encode, where we can base64 encode any string. We're able to concatenate strings as well. This one's used all over the place. We have copy index, which is a way that you can create a set of copies in your template and then reference the index of that particular copy. We can list keys, so perform a post list keys against a storage account in case you need to retrieve storage account keys as a part of template execution. We allow you to pad your strings. We allow you to retrieve parameters, enumerate information about the providers that are registered with Resource Manager, reference a given resource, which is a way of implicitly creating a dependency or a way to retrieve information about a particular resource via GET, like we did in our last example. You can retrieve the execution context of the resource group that you're executing in. You can build a resource ID for a given resource. You can get the subscription context in which your template is running, or you can reference a variable. And so if you're looking for examples of how to use these, what we've done is we've actually created a GitHub repository which contains examples of how to use these elemental template language expressions. And so we have about 24 examples that show you how to do these. We don't have enough time to review all of them today. So what I would do is encourage you on your own time, take a look at these. Maybe we'll have a couple of extra minutes here and we can look at one or two of them that interest you. How does that sound? We'll take a vote here in a minute. Cool? So let's talk a little bit about advanced template scenarios. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we call resource extensions. As I mentioned earlier, Resource Manager allows you to not only define the topology of your applications, but also initialize the resources that exist inside of that resource group. And we do that through what we call resource extensions. So in the case of virtual machines, what does this look like? Well, this looks like DSE, Chef, Puppet, custom script extensions, so on and so forth. Many of you guys have already used these before with the classic compute model. So these function the same way that they always have, okay? For websites, or now app services, we have the web deploy resource extension format. And then for SQL DB, just as an example, we support Backpack for DML and DDL initialization, okay? The next advanced scenario is copies, which in many cases, when we look at applications at scale, you're doing many, many things very repetitively, whether it's how you create a VM or how you connect that VM to a virtual network. We don't want you to have to explicitly perform or express that many, many times over and over again in your template. And so what we allow you to do is add copies to that resource definition, which will tell our template language processor to expand those particular resource entities. Additionally, we allow you to nest templates with multiple deployments, and then we allow you to implement new or existing patterns. So one of the common questions that we get is, do you support conditional or if-then-else logic inside of Resource Manager templates? And the answer is we do not. And the reason why is because one of the promises that we give you with Resource Manager is every time you deploy a template, at the end of execution, you can plan on the same outcome. If we start adding complex logic within the template, then we no longer have deterministic outcomes, okay? So I think I have enough time. Do you guys want to pick one of these to look at? So let's get a vote for resource extensions aren't actually that exciting to see. And I'll show you anyway, so don't worry. So who wants to see copies? Okay, who wants to see nested templates? Okay, and who wants to see newer existing? Okay, so nested templates wins. I shouldn't say that. Wins. We will look at a nested template now based on the opinions of the room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up nestedtemplate.json. And so what you'll see here is what I've done is that new storage account.json template that we ran earlier, all I've done is nested that inside of another template, okay? And so here I have a parameter, which is storage account name, just like we had for the storage account earlier. I have a variable, which in this case I'm just statically defining the nested template that I'm wanting to execute. You'll note this is the same URL we used earlier, okay? And then inside of the resources section, what you'll notice is my type here is not Microsoft.storage WAC storage account. What it is it's Microsoft.resources WAC deployments. And then the properties that I provide here, you'll notice that these are not the properties of the storage account, but rather these are the properties of the deployment that I'm creating, okay? And so in this case, I set deployment mode, which is incremental. I specify the template link. And then inside of there, I have a parameters section, which defines the storage account name, which is a parameter to the nested template. Okay? All that makes sense? Yes, sir.
So this template is calling the other template?
So what's happening, that's a great question. What is happening is this template is creating a deployment which tracks the execution of the other template. Okay? And you can do this many, many times. In fact, if you like, we can transition into looking at a complex example that'll maybe show this along with copies, along with resource extensions. Does that sound good? Okay. So let me go to here. So before we dig into this, how many of you guys have heard of Elasticsearch? Okay, so our demo today is going to be using Elasticsearch. And I want to make sure I don't take credit for somebody else's work. We've actually been having a lot of hackathons, both around the world as well as on Microsoft's campus and at Build last week. And so a gentleman by the name of Trent, he's a great partner and an Azure advisor of ours, has built a really killer Elasticsearch template and contributed it to our GitHub repository. And so I wanted to make sure to recognize him for his great contributions to the effort. So let's go ahead and pull up that template. And in fact, what I wanted to point out to you quickly, inside of the Azure GitHub repository, we have, or I guess organization, we have a repository called Azure Quick Start Templates. This has many, many examples of how to deploy many different types of application using Resource Manager templates. These go all the way from, kind of simple examples like the one that we looked at earlier with my new storage account, all the way up to very, very complex examples like this Elasticsearch cluster that we're going to look at. Okay? And so what I'll do is I'll scroll up to Elasticsearch E. And so I'm going to click this link here, and I'm going to log into the Azure portal. So you'll notice we've deployed via PowerShell, we've deployed via CLI, and now we're going to deploy via portal. And so that button that I clicked, what it does is it deep links into the new Azure portal with the URI of a template that I want to deploy. And so what it'll do is it'll actually launch an extension which allows me to view and edit that template. It'll then inspect that template for the parameters that need to be provided by me, the user, and then I can turn around and deploy it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this template. It's inspected that now and built a set of parameters for me to enter, and so I'll enter those now. You'll note here that it is able to see default values as well, so that I don't have to enter those. I can specify whether or not I want a jump box, how many VM client nodes I want to have, the size of those VM client nodes. We'll just go with the standard there. The size of my data nodes. Data disk size. That's fine. And then the version of Elasticsearch that I want to deploy. Yes?
Because you're feeding the JSON into the UI, you're getting some validation on some of the unique names like storage accounts and so on and so forth. My question is, if you were to feed that in PowerShell and you were to prompt the user to enter in the parameters, is the same validation there? So if you put a storage account name that was already used or so on and so forth?
Yeah, so what would happen in that case from PowerShell or CLI is we would execute the template. We would get an error back from the storage resource provider telling us that name is in use. However, the user can then turn around. So what will happen is when we see that area, we'll stop execution on that particular branch of the dependency graph that we built from the template. Okay? And so the cool thing is the user can then just say, oh, I want to do this again with a different storage account name. They can rerun the template without needing to worry about like delete or anything else because of that guarantee we give you about template deployment item potency. Did I answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, sir.
In terms of his question, is there like a get verb that I can use to say, what this user's about to propose is already in use, so I'll do some while looping in my own PowerShell code to kind of control that, so it'll be a one-stop shopping experience for the user?
That's a great question. So if I may, let me kick off this deployment because it'll take a few minutes and I'll answer your question while it runs. So I'm going to create a new resource group. I'm going to call this Ignite Demo Rye Jones. No, I'll just do Ignite Demo. And then I'll select a resource group location, West US, and create. Okay. So to answer your question, sir, is there a way that I can perform gets to, for example, find out if a resource already exists? Okay, so let's think about this in two categories. One is it's a resource that exists that is your resource. Okay, and we do have, in that case, yes, we do have generic resource commandlets, get Azure resource, which allow you to retrieve that resource as long as it's in a subscription and a resource group to which you have access. However, there are certain resource names which must be globally unique. So for example, storage account name is a really good example of these, right? And so if I were to perform a get storage account name for, let's say, Ignite Demo, it would come back empty because I don't have access to a subscription with that, but I'm pretty sure someone here at Ignite has created a storage account called Ignite Demo, right? So in those cases, we're in the process of building out what I would call a set of check availability style APIs where you're able to perform a post and we look to see whether or not it's available. However, we don't, like, of course, allow you to actually get details about the storage account. We just say, Ignite Demo's taken. But yes, exactly, precisely. I will say that is not universally available yet across all the resource types because we've gotten that feedback and it's in flight. Cool? So let's go ahead and switch back while our template deploys. So I want to change gears now. We've talked a lot about deployment. We've gone through, actually about half of our session time talking about deployment. And I want to talk about organization for a bit. This is one of the most common questions we get about Resource Manager and about resource groups. And once again, as I said earlier, it becomes very, very important to people as they grow in their usage and adoption of cloud because you have resource sprawl and it's very difficult to start to understand like which resources are associated with which applications and who should have access to those resources and how they're associated with the various applications. And so we have three main ways that we allow you to organize your resources. Number one is through resource groups, which we spoke about earlier, the same way that folders allow you to organize your files. The next are what we call linked resources, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. And then tags are a mechanism that we have which allow you to attach little bits of information to individual resources or resource groups and then query across your subscription, okay? So let's talk about a few different ways that you can use resource groups. The first thing is, let's assume for a moment you have a 3-tier application template. This application has a database for data persistence. It has an app service or a website for hosting the web tier of your application. And then it has a virtual machine tier for, let's say, caching or middleware or something like that. Well, in this example, we're using an application-centric resource group and an application-centric template, okay? This would be analogous to a template for a SharePoint farm, as an example, where you have one template for the SharePoint farm, and you have one resource group containing all of the resources in that SharePoint farm, okay? So, example number 2, application-centric resource groups and tier-centric templates, okay? So one of the things that we spoke about earlier was how you could nest deployments, right? Well, you don't necessarily have to nest deployments to be able to deploy more than one template to a given resource group, okay? And so in this case, what we've done is we've created 3 separate templates, one for each tier of the application. We still deploy them into the same resource group, but it's not all one template, okay? Now, the variant on this, the nested template variant, is you still have those 3 primary templates in our last example, but you create nested deployments, and you have a, let's say, a master or a parent template, which contains all of these. So everything's still deployed into one resource group together. However, rather than needing your user to run template A, B, C, they're able to execute template D, which in turn runs template A, B, and C. Okay? The final option that you have available, and we see this used a lot with very, very large-scale applications, is where you have a tier-centric resource group and a tier-centric template approach. Okay? So what you'll notice is you have your database tier deployed into a database tier resource group, the web tier deployed into a web tier resource group, VM tier into VM tier resource group. Now, one of the things that you might be asking is, well, my web tier and database tier are probably still coupled. And so how do I express that relationship that needs to exist between my website and my database? And candidly, it probably exists with the virtual machine too, but I guess I didn't have enough room for arrows on the slide. But the way you express that is through what we call a linked resource. And what you're able to say is, hey, you know what, even though this other resource does not exist in my resource group, I still have a dependency on it. And I still want to know that these things are somehow related to each other. Okay? Make sense? So, we've talked about resource groups. We've talked about linked resources. And I want to talk a little bit about resource tags. So resource tags are name-value pairs that are assigned to resources or resource groups. And what this does is this gives you a subscription-wide taxonomy for organizing or categorizing all of your resources. Each resource or resource group can have up to 15 tags each. So I have a confession to make. The first time I saw this feature, I was like, why in the heck would anybody use that? And sometimes I'm a little dense. I'll admit that. So I sat down with a bunch of folks, and we thought, hey, there are actually a bunch of very compelling scenarios for how you use tags. Number one, and I'm sure everyone in this room, how many of you have both staging or pre-production and production environments? Everybody, right? Wouldn't it be nice to know with one query which resources are for pre-prod and which resources are for production? You can now do that with tags. Additionally, you can tag by role. So you can tag all of your VMs that host web workload with a web tag, cache tag, database tag, so on and so forth. Other option, tag by department, right? So is this application or these resources, are they owned by finance, or are they for HR, or for they retail or legal? Because we want to make sure the legal guys get the right bill, and then the final thing is tag by responsible party. I like this. So when I can't say that. When things break, whose throat do I choke? Right? And so this provides you with a way to tag the responsible party for a given resource group or for a given resource as well. Okay? So with that in mind, let's change gears and let's demonstrate tagging. And so let's see, we've done PowerShell, we've done Azure CLI, we've done Portal, and so let's do tags from CLI. So I'll kick off this little batch command. And so here what I'm going to do, that Ignite demo resource group that we create earlier, I'm going to set on that resource group tags, environment, and production, because this is a very important demo, guys, and I don't want anybody to mess with my Elasticsearch application while we're here together, okay? And so what you'll see is I set that tag, and then immediately I then list list all of the resources that have the tag of environment set to production, and it immediately brings that resource group back, okay? So 2 little commands showing how tags can be used, okay? Once again, you can set up to 15 of these on a resource or on a resource group. So now let's talk a little bit about now that you've deployed your resources to Azure, now that you've organized your resources in Azure, how you can control access to these things. In some ways, in my mind, it's how we bring order to what can otherwise be a little bit crazy in the cloud. Even though we want to be agile, we want to move quickly, we need to make sure that the right processes and controls are in place to ensure that we can, deliver services reliably. And so there are 3 main feature areas that we have to support this. Number 1 is role-based access control. This was the number 1 request for Azure on user voice for like 3 years. It's there. Use it. We also have audit logs and resource logs. So let's go through some of these concepts and we'll explore how we can use these. So role-based access control. What it does, it allows secure access with granular permissions to various resources. Now this access can be assigned to users, it can be assigned to groups, or it can be assigned to service principals. And the thing that we realized is managing access control and permissions can actually be very, very complicated. And so what we tried to do was come up with a set of canonical or built-in roles, which make it easy to get started with role-based access control. So there are 2 main concepts that we have to make sure that we understand before we can effectively use RBAC. Number 1 is the role definition. And what the role definition does is it describes the set of actions that someone who has this role assigned to them can perform. So this could be read actions. This could be read and write actions. This could be read, write, plus grant permissions to other folks on those resources, right? The other thing is these role definitions can be used in multiple assignments, okay? And so, for example, if we have a read-only permission, we can read only at many, many scopes for the same user. Okay, so we shouldn't assume that because I set read-only at a particular place, I can't set read-only again at another place. Okay, very, very flexible. One thing that we don't do, and this is important, is we don't have a deny ACL. How many of you guys have had to troubleshoot when someone didn't have access to something and it was because of a deny ACL? And then you said, hey, Microsoft, I really want a resultant set of policy viewer so that I can troubleshoot these things more easily, yes? So we didn't really want to have to build a resultant set of policy viewer, and so what we do is we just don't do deny right now, okay? It's not to say we won't ever do it, we just really don't want to, okay? So the second concept we really need to dig into here are what we call role assignments. So role assignments associate the role definition that we just spoke about with an identity that can be a user, group, or service principal at a particular scope, which could be subscription scope, resource group scope, or individual resource scope, okay? And these role assignments are always inherited, okay? And so what this means is if I grant someone a given set of permissions at subscription scope, it's inherited down to the resource group scope and inherited down to the resource scope inside of that. So to visualize this, at the top, at subscription level, I can define a set of contributors, owners, and readers. These people also have permissions, those same level of permissions, if they're granted at resource group. Once again, it's inherited downstream. I can then grant permissions to people at the resource group level, which also gives them permissions to the resources inside of the resource groups to which I granted them permissions. Or at the bottom tier, I can grant people permissions at the individual resource level, okay? And so you might be asking, well, how do you do that? Well, the answer is when we designed the Resource Manager APIs, we designed them explicitly with 2 things in mind. Actually, a lot of things in mind, but 2 big things. One is that we had to be able to convert those declarative templates into a series of imperative API calls. That's what allows us to begin templating against a new service that onboards in Azure as soon as they've plugged into Resource Manager. Our various services don't actually know what a template is, Resource manager is really the only person or only entity that knows what the template is. Okay? The next thing is we only allow resources to be represented through one and only one resource URI. And what that allows us to do is use the URI or the ID of that resource to perform access checks. Okay? And so, for example, here is an example or a URI for a particular site. And what you'll see is we can allow someone to perform actions at subscriptions WAC subscription ID. We can do it at resource group WAC resource group name, or we can do it further down in the URI string where we actually have sites WAC site. Okay? So, one other point I want to touch on before we go into demo mode is in addition to the owner, contributor, and reader roles that we have that are generic and can be applied to any resource provider or any resource, or at resource group scope or at subscription scope, we also have a set of service-specific roles. There are now about 2 to 3 dozen of them, which have even more tailored access for things such as like website contributor or database admin, okay? So we've really enhanced the set of roles that we have available. Now you might be asking, well, when can I define my own custom roles? You would not be the first person to ask us that, and so we're thinking quite a bit about it, and we're working hard on it. We won't let you do deny, but we're working hard on that as well. So let's go in and demo for a moment, okay? So let's see, we'll do this demo in PowerShell. Sorry. So the first thing that we're going to do is, as I mentioned earlier, role assignments are always made to a particular user, group, or service account. Okay? And so the first thing that I have to do is I have to get the object ID of that entity from, in this case, Azure Active Directory. Well, in this case, I'm going to get it from our dev lead, right? Because let's assume for a moment my application is having problems, and I need someone smarter than me to help me figure out what's going on, okay? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the resource group that I want to grant him access to. And then after that, what I do is I create a new role assignment for his object ID. I'm going to give him contributor permissions so that he can't turn around and give the whole engineering department permissions to my resource. And then I'm going to set the scope at the resource group level. Okay? And so I'll run this. And I hit F5 instead of F8, so it's actually going to remove it immediately as well. But you'll see there in the blue part behind the screen, you'll see we created the policy, and then right now it's prompting me, asking me if I want to remove it. So let's pretend for a moment I decided it wasn't such a great idea to give Charles access to my application. And so we removed the policy just as quickly as easily as we created it. Okay? So this can also be done through the portal. Okay, when you're in the portal, let's see, I guess I still have it up so we could just show you. I can go to a particular resource. How about this one? I don't even know what this resource is. Probably because I gave someone permissions to my account. And so you'll notice there will be a common little set of people here. I can click on that. I can view who currently has permissions at this scope. And then I can go in and I can assign a role to a given user or group, or I can come in and I can select, you aren't going to use yours, I assume. I can select this here. Oh, it's inherited, so I actually can't remove it here. I would have to go to the subscription scope where I granted Emily Kurjan access to remove his access, okay? So just because I'm showing things in the PowerShell or CLI, I'm trying to show how you can automate it. That doesn't mean it's not available in the UX, okay? So let's switch back. The next thing I want to talk about is how to audit what people are doing in your applications once you've granted them those access. So one of the interesting things is in the new ARM world, all management operations are performed through Resource Manager. And so what this does is this allows us to journal all write, all deletion, or all actions that are performed against your resources. We don't currently journal reads because you'd have like 10 bajillion of them, and it really wouldn't be super useful. Even though if that is something that you would like to see, let us know and we'll consider it. So we log all of these things to a central location, and we log them in a common format. And so what this means is you can go into the portal and you can view all the things that have been done against a resource group, or you can use our REST APIs, PowerShell, or CLI to retrieve this information. And so let's quickly look at what this looks like. So I'm going to go back into PowerShell. I'm going to go to logs. And so what you'll see here is I get Azure Resource Group log. I provide the resource group name for which I want to retrieve the log information. I provide it with a start time. In this case, I'm just saying, hey, anything in the last hour, and the end time for this query. I'm now going to run it. And so what you'll see is lots and lots of things or information about what's been done against this resource group. And so you'll notice for each of these actions, we have things like who. Oh, it's not going to let me click or highlight, but we show who is the caller, who performed that action. We show why they were able to do it, because I am the subscription admin. We'll show the scope of the action and then the particular thing that was done against it. The resource group name, the resource ID, the status, so on and so forth, right? So the cool thing is this could actually be sucked out into another external system if you're wanting to, perform any sort of analysis or whatever else against, the events that we've journaled for your subscription or resources or resource group. Okay. Do tags show up here? No, they do not. If you wanted to see the tags, you could use the resource ID, perform a get against that, and then that would return the tags back to you. This, I know, seems very verbose, but we're trying to limit the information that comes back in our audit logs just because of the sheer scale of the number of things that we're currently logging. Similar to why we don't do reads right now. Okay. Actually, one thing that people ask about reads, they're like, well, what if someone performed a read of a password? And the answer is, well, so we consider passwords to be a secret, and we never return passwords through gets. Okay, we always return passwords on posts, which is considered an action, and therefore it is audited. Okay? Yes, sir.
How far back in time can you go? Is there a retention policy we could set?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm happy to take your card and answer as a follow-up, okay? I apologize. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Could you add in that single process the rollover retention of logs, not just how long they're retained, but how often you want to change to, I don't know how, does it put them in a database, is it just a file system? There probably should be some controls on how long to keep logs, how often you start new logs.
That's a good point. So I can tell you the mechanism that we use for storing all this data is Azure Tables and Queues, and retention is governed by there's a generic agreement that you sign when you use Azure that governs how long we retain the data. What I don't remember, to this gentleman's point, is what exactly that number is. Okay? But I promise you it's not like IIS logs written somewhere. Okay. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to control is resource locks. And this is probably the simplest feature we're going to talk about today. Oh, yes, sir.
Just real quick on audit logs. I saw a correlation ID entry there.
Yes.
On errors, do you guys output the correlation ID?
So on all...
As a mechanism to search through the logs to figure out what's happening?
So not only on errors, but on all requests, we have a correlation ID, and that's exactly why we use it. Because when you think about Azure, it's a pretty massively distributed system, and we wanted to have one ID that would allow us to trace the call all the way through the stack. So actually, that brings up a great point. Something breaks, and you have to talk to Azure support. You now actually have one ID that says, I was trying to do this. And you can give them the correlation ID, and they can actually search that call all the way through the system. Okay, so when our guys are on servicing rotation, I want to say we live and die by the correlation ID. That sounds a little strong, but you understand what I mean when I say that.
Is that only a product of the resource manager, or is that a product of the old service management way as well?
I don't believe correlation ID was required in the service management APIs. It is a requirement for resource manager APIs. It's a common header that we set, and so the resource providers are supposed to journal that information as a part of their operational logging. Okay. So, simplest feature we're going to talk about today, but probably my favorite. Resource locks exist because accidents happen, and they really try to help prevent them. So how many of you have ever accidentally deleted a production virtual machine or storage account? Okay, so there's a couple of honest folks in the room. What's that?
No one else wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've done it before, and everybody laughed at me, and it was pretty embarrassing. That gentleman was probably one of the people that laughed at me. So anyway, resource locks allow administrators to create policy which prevent accidental deletion of resources, okay? So with that in mind, 3 key concepts here. Number 1 is what is a resource lock? Well, it's a policy which enforces a lock level at a particular scope. What is a lock level? Well, a lock level is the type of enforcement. Currently, we support cannot delete. We've been debating adding another one like read-only. Your feedback will drive whether or not we add that support, okay? And then finally, scope, which is the realm to which the lock level is applied. This, kind of like with RBAC, is expressed as a URI, okay? So it can be set at the resource group or the resource scope, okay? And so I'm now going to demo setting resource locks via PowerShell. And so what you'll see here is in my first command, I'm going to create a resource lock, and I'm going to create it at the resource group level. I'm able to provide some notes for it, and as well as name the lock. So I'm going to run that. It's going to ask if I'm really sure. I'm going to say yes. And so you'll see I get the information back about that particular resource lock. The next thing I can do is get resource locks. And you can see, yes, I did in fact create that resource lock. The most helpful use for this is when you try to delete something and you mean to, finding out which stinking resource lock is preventing you from deleting it. I know I've been there before. And then the final thing that we can do is, because we're drawing to a close here today, is I can turn around and actually remove the resource lock, which will then once again allow users to come in and delete the resources in that resource group. You know what? Did I skip a demo? We looked at did we do troubleshooting? We did not, did we? I have a feeling that our deployment earlier might have failed. Magic of television. Oh, what do you know? Deployment failed. Oh, sorry. Yes, my deployment failed. So what you'll see here is you can get this information from PowerShell or from Exploit CLI, as we were showing earlier, but we also showed this information in the portal. And you can go in and look at the particular operation which failed. And so here it gives me this message that tells me completed with terminal provisioning state failed. Probably not going to win the award for most helpful error message there, am I? Go into resource groups. And we'll click on Ignite Demo. And I will click on Last Deployment. And so what you'll see here is all of those nested deployments used in my complex template are actually listed right here, and so I can see more specifically what failed inside of shared. And so what you'll see is I had 2 failures. One was inside of networking, which means I probably typed something in incorrectly. And see here, what we'll see is someone has already created a storage account called Rye Jones Shared. Okay? So, to the point earlier, what happens if someone creates your app with a storage account that already exists? This does. But I could turn around and redeploy my template and recover it into a good state. So, with that in mind, this actually brings us, oh yes?
If you were to redeploy that template, obviously some stuff succeeded.
Yep.
So it's just going to kind of pass over that?
Yeah, so what happens is Resource Manager performs the put against the various resource provider, and the expected behavior is they turn around and they say, oh, I already have a thing, and all of its properties match, and so therefore I don't need to do anything. It returns 200 OK, and we proceed with template execution. We don't try to be that smart. We let the individual services be smart for us, because they know whether the website has changed better than we do. Yes, sir?
Could you use that same concept if you were trying to, say, resize like VM instances?
That's
If you wanted to resize, you could come through and set all the parameters to different size and execute the exact same template, same name, but as it comes through, it's going to resize.
exactly right.
Unless you can lock up.
I'm sorry? Yes, unless you had a lock, or unless you didn't have RBAC access to it, would be the other thing. So, with this in mind, now what? Well, what I would implore you to do is deploy a template today. So, we have lots of IaaS examples available in the Azure public GitHub repository under the Quick Start templates. Number 2 is we have lots and lots of examples of how to use the template language expressions available at that second link. And then finally, we've spent a lot of time working on improving our documentation for Azure Resource Manager over the last couple months. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at the documentation that we have available to you. So when it comes to next steps, in fact, speaking of some of that documentation, lots and lots of links that you guys can follow if you download the PowerPoint deck. So we have about, wow, almost right on time, 15 minutes, 13 minutes it looks like, for our question and answer time. I want to thank you guys for joining me today to talk a little bit about Resource Manager. I know it's late and I know the bus lines are maybe starting to get a little long, so I will stay here as long as you guys want to answer questions, but I don't want to retain you. So if you can, please use the microphone to ask your questions. Gosh, you guys are awesome. And I failed earlier for not always repeating the question. The recording folks will tell me I'm a bad person for that. But anyway, questions. Thank you guys very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of quick questions, right? So there was a demo yesterday where with a TPM server, right, you're going to be able to encrypt a VM. When that becomes generally available, if I create a resource group and I've applied metadata to the resource group, am I also going to be able to encrypt the resource group, just not the VMs inside? And if I do encrypt the resource groups, does the metadata then become invisible to, let's say, an auditor? Right, so let's say I'm Sarbanes-Oxley enforcement, right? They create an accounting system. I've got to know where all the components are, right, for compliance, but it might be invisible to me with my credential.
That's an excellent point and an excellent question. So in the case of leveraging Key Vault, what happens is secrets, rather than being handled by value, are handled by reference. And through some magic that I don't claim to begin to understand, those secrets are accessible to the various services that need to access them. Actually, you grant permissions to those services to access them, okay? And so the thing is, in the case of the template just has references saying, oh, by the way, there's a key that is identified by this URI that compute or the Key Vault aware resource provider should use. We don't actually we aren't able to access or see that key. And so the key doesn't actually encrypt the template itself. The template remains in clear text. The only thing that's encrypted is, of course, the secret that's over here that is only accessed by the resource provider through a reference. Okay? So for auditing perspective, all of the stuff around who did what is still maintained in clear text, because what you're doing is actually encrypting the data at rest, at runtime level, rather than encrypting the management surfaces that exist around it.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
Then the follow-up is the not being able to delete, right? So I've got an administrator who's created a resource group, again using that Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So he's the super user, he created the whole thing, but I need somebody in compliance to say, you know what, this cannot be deleted unless I approve the deletion. So how do you, I guess the term super user, right? Super user, but he still has admin rights, right? So he still gets to delete a VM if he wants, right? Even if he can't delete the resource group, he could still delete some of the internal pieces, even though I say he doesn't have the right to delete.
Yes, that's a great point. One of the things when it comes to resource locks is if I create a resource, lock, I actually can't delete the resource myself until I remove the management lock. Okay, so at that point you begin to have some very, very, you have a sequence of actions that express extreme intent to delete or destroy that data, similar to ripping the disk out of the server and throwing it in the disk shredder or crusher, right? With that said, I don't know if we have a way to revoke owner permissions as you've described in your scenario. So that's something interesting to think about. Because today when someone creates a resource, we more or less assume they have owner permissions to it, with the exception of some of the nuanced contributor stuff. So what it could be is your regular admins should only be contributors, maybe at subscription scope, and then your compliance people are in fact the owners. So that might be one way to address your scenario. Yes, so one thing I didn't talk about today is RBAC assignments at the resource group as well as the resource level can be included as a part of the template. So that could be something that could be powerful as well for you to do as a part of your application deployment. Okay? Did that answer your question? Okay.
Just two quick questions. The first one is I noticed that in the new Azure portal, for anything that's created with the ARM templates, you have a V2. So V2 for VMs, V2 for resource groups, some of the V2s.
Yes.
So in my subscription, I don't see the V2s. Is that because you guys don't light it up? We have about 45 subscriptions and none of them. Is that because you don't light it up for all the subscriptions, or do I actually have to go through this process and create some resource groups via the templates to actually expose some of the V2 objects? In other words, am I not seeing the V2s because possibly I don't have any V2s?
I don't believe our browse menu today is dynamic. I'm scanning the room for a portal team person in the room. I can
I'll
follow
follow
up
up
on
with that because I just wondered because I know you just opened up the providers last week at Build, so
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a granular process for you guys to push it out to all the
No,
subscriptions.
everybody should have access at this
Okay.
point. So
And then another quick question. So I understand that the cloud services concept is deprecated in this model.
that's a tricky question.
Well, here's why
Yes.
I asked. So we have a significant investment in that PaaS,
Yep.
the PaaS model where we leverage cloud services because we've got startup scripts and we actually have to do things on the VM itself.
Yes.
So in that model, can I still create those same type of PaaS instances or those same type of compute instances that I can go into and execute the startup scripts and so on and so forth through resource groups?
That's an excellent question. So cloud services in some ways are similar to resource groups and in other ways are different, okay? And so what you'll find is, for example, all the IaaS v2 stuff is no longer created in the context of a cloud service, while IaaS v1 stuff was.
I think the IaaS stuff is pretty clear just on the architecture changes,
Yes.
but we're left with that little gap for the PaaS stuff.
Yes, so in particular, so you're using web and worker role in cloud services.
Yeah.
We do have a shim for Resource Manager that allows you to include web worker cloud services projects inside of a Resource Manager template.
Okay, cool.
With that said, I mean, one of the things that we are looking at with IaaS v2 is to allow more people that were traditionally using web and worker role to see some of the, we're trying to make IaaS more PaaS-like, if that makes sense, the resource extension model. And so we would encourage you, over time to start looking at how to use DSC, Chef, Puppet, so on and so forth for new development. But
So go back to the IaaS persistent VM concept.
potentially.
Okay. Thank you so much.
But to be clear, you can definitely include cloud services in your resource manager templates.
I mean, you can include web roles and worker roles, right?
Yes, sir.
You're not including a cloud service, right? You're adding a web role or a worker role to a resource group.
It looks like a cloud service being added.
Okay.
It's because that was the thinnest way for us to wrap that.
Okay. Good presentation, by the way. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
In regards to the tags, is there, who has control over them as far as editing or modifying them? And is there any maybe intention in the future to be able to assign security based upon tags?
That's a great question. So today, if you have permissions to write on a resource, you have permissions to change the tags, is the way it works out. As for RBAC based on tags, that's something we've heard before. It's also kind of like deny,
Yeah.
and that we're a little bit concerned about the complexity.
It's almost like a filter as opposed to an actual.
Exactly, but excellent feedback, and
Okay.
like heard, point taken, and so by the way, some of the times when I say, it seems like this could be problematic, and so we haven't done it yet, it's not that I'm saying we won't do it, it's just we haven't been able to come up with, in our mind, a good way to do it yet, because what we find is when you ship services, it's really hard to unship them. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you guys so much for joining. Have a great evening. Is the party tonight or tomorrow night? Tomorrow? Okay, well, then I can't tell you to enjoy the party then. Take care, guys. Have a good one.